Was working a little better. Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to week 4 of HCDE's research seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor and Associate Chair Beth Kolko. And Beth is really special in my heart. So she was one of my first mentors when I first came to UW and is still one of the people that I go to for advice most often in the department. And so I'm really excited. Beth has had a really great, wonderful career. She's done everything from studying the early days of the internet and things like online games like MUDs and things along those lines when they're first coming out. Thinking about technology and emerging technology in countries who are just adopting it for the first time. And now she's thinking about capitalism for humans. She's also had a successful startup, went through Y Combinator, and took some time off to launch her startup Shift Lab. So she has a unique experience of kind of being out in the real world, which is not the same for all of us academics who spend all our time in the ivory tower. So with that, I'm going to introduce Beth. Well, I've already introduced Beth, but I'm going to hand it over to Beth and let her give her talk on capitalism for humans.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for that very kind introduction. What Julie didn't say, there's two things that she didn't say in that introduction. One is that she's also the person I go to most often for advice, and that really the TLDR on that intro is that I'm old, so I've been around for a while. So thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it. If you had looked at the schedule, you might have seen that this talk was supposed to happen a few weeks from now. So it's happening a little earlier than originally planned, so it's a little bit different. But that said, I'm excited to be here and to talk about this new project of mine and a new lab. So the abstract for this talk, by the way, can you hear me okay in the back? The mic is good? Great. So what I'd like to do with this talk is introduce a new research area that's been under development for the past few years. Human-centered entrepreneurship is the best way to characterize it, and it is motivated by what I refer to as a wellspring of optimism, which is not always how I have felt about technology, but it is how I feel now. That if we narrow the gaps between researchers who study technology, so those academics, and don't let Julie fool you, she's not stuck in the ivory tower at all. But if we narrow the gaps between researchers of technology in academia and then the implementers of technology, like people who are starting companies, I think we have an opportunity. I think we really do legitimately have an opportunity to build better technologies, but more than that, better companies, so better structures to support those technologies. So, with that said, I will say hello. So last month, September, marked the 30th anniversary of when I first started as a professor. And my path through those decades has not always been I can't advance. There we go. Has not always been on this campus, but it has also not always been this straight and linear. And the context of some of the things that Julie talked about is really key for this talk, so I'm going to just start with a couple minutes about that context. So the first 20 years of my career as an academic, I did the things that professors do. I wrote papers and wrote grants, ran a lab, worked with PhD students, and for a long time, I studied the social impact of technology writ large, and then eventually started working on healthcare technologies, primarily in the global south. So some of that was on hardware interventions, so building like medtech, and then the rest of it was digital health prototypes, so all kinds of digital health interventions. And doing that in collaboration with colleagues in the School of Medicine and in computer science, what gradually became clear is there were lots of really great ideas that my colleagues and my students were developing, but very few of those things were getting out into the world and having broad impact. And so I sort of spent a lot of time thinking about how could we close that gap. And at some point, I decided, well, I'm going to try to figure this out by doing it. And so I decided to start a company. And I could have started a nonprofit. I could have made the decision that a nonprofit was the way to go. but I didn't. And one of the reasons that I didn't is, as a professor who had been writing grants and had sort of experienced that world for several years, it became, I don't know, some of the dynamics of nonprofits made it seem like that wasn't the route that I wanted to go. So I'm curious, has anyone here ever worked in a nonprofit? All right, a few hands. So one of the things that's so interesting about nonprofits is that there's a sort of discontinuity between the people who run the nonprofit and then the beneficiaries of the work of the nonprofit. And also, nonprofits are governed by boards, as companies are. And usually nonprofit boards, honestly, Julie and I sort of made this realization at the same point in our lives, and we're both sort of astonished by this. It's the people who have a lot of money who end up on the boards of nonprofits, because you're expected to make a big donation or bring in a big donation. So you've got, those are the people who are setting the agenda of the organization, and yet they don't necessarily have the lived experience of the kinds of change they're trying to bring into the world. And so I thought, okay, well, I don't want to do that. That's not what I want to do. What I wanted to do instead was think about how a for-profit might be, ironically, more human-centered. And there, I mean, I think you can do this framing where with a for-profit entity, you have to deliver some kind of product that's so compelling that the intended beneficiary is willing to actually, is invested enough to pay for it. So I say that, and then I sort of will pull back and provide a caveat. I am not arguing. I'm not the kind of person who argues for the privatization of everything. I have spent my career teaching in public universities for a reason. I believe in nonprofits. I believe in public goods. But there are some times where I would argue that a for-profit organization is better able to deliver certain solutions. So I decided to start a company, and then so I did that, and so it was a medical device company. Here's the short version. It was a medical device company, ran for about 10 years. We got 3 products through FDA. We sold products around the world. It was really hard, really great. We went through Y Combinator with that company. It was the most transformative experience of my life. Always happy to talk about that. If you're not familiar, Y Combinator is an incubator down in Silicon Valley. Sold that company last year. Fun fact, sold it twice, but that's a different story. And then in about 2018, I started working in venture capital. So in 2018, I joined a venture fund based in California called Pioneer Fund. No relationship whatsoever to Pioneer Square Labs. Very confusing to say that here in Seattle. And it's actually former YC alum, and we invest primarily in YC companies. And then a couple years after that, I helped a guy named Ken Hornstein, who some of you might know, start PAC Ventures, which is focused on the University of Washington ecosystem. So both spin-outs from the UW, but also if you graduated from UW and you start a company 10 years down the line, PAC is a potential investor for that company. So helped him get that off the ground, saw things from 0 to 1, and then for Fund 2, stepped into an advisory role and introduced him to his partner for that next one. So that's the sort of context thing for me. The other thing that I want to share here is when I was running Shift Labs, I did the startup thing as an operator, if you've heard that term. So I wasn't like a chief science officer. I wasn't doing it like as an academic advising the startup. I was the CEO, and we never became giant. We were always a small company, even when we were selling around the world. And so I got to see it all, for better or for worse. I will say in terms of my gray hair, definitely for worse. But in terms of the analytical work that I'm able to do today, definitely for the better. So involved in product, involved in marketing, involved in sales, involved in manufacturing, involved in repairs, involved in training, involved in patents, involved in everything. And that really has informed the work that I'm doing today. Okay, so that's enough context, I feel. All right, so capitalism for humans, what does that mean? So a few years ago also in the department, I started teaching this class. I don't know if anyone here has taken Building a Human-Centered Venture. Okay. Oh, hi, Adrian. So I teach this class in our master's program, although Adrian's a PhD student. And after teaching this class for several years, I was like, well, I had to develop all these materials to teach the class, so I started writing a book based on it. And so one of my dear colleagues, wonderful person, has been helping me structure the book. And at one point I emailed her and I was like, hey, what do you think about the title Capitalism for Humans? And her response was, why don't you put a question mark after it? As in, can capitalism be good for humans? And I was like, no, I'm not going to put a question mark after it. I'm going to be optimistic and assert that capitalism can be good for humans. Which is not to say that it always is. Again, not an apologist for capitalism. There's many bad things. And in fact, there's a talk tomorrow by Aaron McElroy, who is a professor in geography, and they have a book called Silicon Valley Imperialism, Techno-Fantasies and Frictions in Post-Socialist Times. Sounds like an amazing critique of capitalism. Recommend you go. It's tomorrow at, I forget, didn't put that on the slide, at 12:30. So, and I think also on Zoom. Just trying to balance it out, right? I'm the optimist. I know there's a lot of things wrong. This little chart is a great example of what's wrong, particularly the within country inequality line, that increase, right? We are essentially living through another Gilded Age, and it's no fun. So the critiques of capitalism are essential, and there is, in fact, plenty to critique. But there's also that optimistic view. And one of the things that we are doing in my research group this quarter, and I think there's a few people from the research group, right? At least one who I walked over with. Are you the only one? Oh, we only got one today. All right. But one of the things that we're doing in that group this quarter is we're doing a bunch of definitional work around the terms of capitalism. And one of the things that I found most, compelling, that the students who were working on a definition of the term itself, capitalism, one of them brought in the work of Schumpeter, who was from the early 20th century. And one of the things that he says is, look, capitalism it's changing, and it's an evolving system. He also thought, he was the person who coined the term creative destruction. He also made the claim that capitalism might, in fact, change so much that it will destroy itself. It's possible. Stay tuned. But really, what might happen if we were to make an effort to reform the system and make it work better? Is that even possible? So there's basically two things that the Lab for Human-Centered Entrepreneurship is focused on. The first is building better companies, and the second is building different kinds of companies. And I'll say more about that in just a second. So to be clear, this is a view from inside the system, right? This is all coming from the experience of having built a company, spending a decade doing that, making products. And I mentioned, look, we never got giant, so I was involved in everything. But thinking about all these processes, including, everything, like I mentioned, like from supply chain to patent strategy, everything. And because I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, I got really interested in thinking about how design and capitalism are intertwined, and how design perspectives can inform the practices of entrepreneurship. And I'm conflating entrepreneurship and capitalism. It's a little sloppy, but it's convenient for today. But thinking about entrepreneurship, commercialization, things like that. And how can we produce new models for these practices, specifically for how we're building companies? Because in design, certainly in our department, when we talk about design, we often talk about products. We'll talk about systems design. We'll talk about some process design, but we don't use these incredibly valuable tool sets and mindsets that we have as often in thinking about the creation of an entire organization, okay, and all of the processes and structures that get embedded within. So I mentioned there's two things that we're doing in the Lab for Human-Centered Entrepreneurship. The pushing for two different changes to two different kinds of models. And the first is a recognition, this is an understatement, this next sentence, a recognition that many of the companies that are built around technological innovations end up being financially successful, but somewhat less productive for society overall. That's the understatement part. And here I would invite you to think about what are the most annoying things in your daily life when it comes to dealing with large companies. Take a moment, if you can narrow it down to 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 8. Like my personal, let's see, what do I hate the most? I hate phone trees. You can't reach a person, and then you reach what you think is a person, but now AI, thanks AI, it's not a person. What else do I really hate? Sorry?
Google's ads that take up half the page.
Oh yeah, Google Ads. I'm sorry, Google is a terrible search engine now, right? Or Amazon. Oh my God, sponsored. I don't know. Anyone want to share like the thing that they hate most about late stage capitalism, other than income inequality? Adrian, what do you got?
When I'm booking flights, at the very end, there's actually so much advertisement for insurance that it's genuinely difficult to find the button.
I have gotten stuck there. Why won't it let me purchase? Yep.
The attention economy.
Oh, the attention economy is very sad. And I'm going to talk about business models later in this talk, and the attention economy and all of its soul-sucking elements are inextricably intertwined with the business models that have been chosen to fuel those technologies. And so actually, I'm so glad you said that, because one of the reasons I'm so interested in entrepreneurship is I've done a lot of work over the years with folks at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and a lot of engagement with large tech companies to get them to be better about privacy and things like misinformation, things like that. But it's so hard to steer the ship once the company is large and that business model is baked in. But with startups, nothing is yet written. You have an incredible opportunity to help change how a company gets built, how it gets established, how it grows, and ultimately how it can impact the world. And so it's just this beautiful potential intervention moment. And I feel like people in our field are not, that it's like a missed opportunity. So thank you. All right, so that's the first, right? Companies, sometimes they're not very good and we can do better. But then the other part of it is there are many technological innovations out there which are potentially quite useful to society. I like to use the phrase technologies or innovations that advance the plot of humanity, like things that could be really great, but they're not necessarily venture scale, and I'll get to what venture scale means in a moment. And so they're not going to be unicorns. They're not going to be worth $1 billion or $10 billion. And what that means is, given the way the economic structure is around entrepreneurship, it's very difficult for those companies to find funding and to find mentorship. And so one of the things that we're doing in the lab is creating models for that. So I think that's where I'm going to wrap up the talk. Okay, so the goal generally for human-centered entrepreneurship practices is to identify interventions that can change the trajectory for both the kinds of companies, right? Let's make them less destructive, and then also help the other kind survive, find the funding they need and the mentorship to be strong companies. And design as a discipline really does give us a variety of tools to use in a reconceptualization of innovation processes, whether it's critique stemming from critical cultural theory, iteration borrowed from design process, or a systems thinking approach. Those are all some of the tools we can use. That mindset, tool set, the methodologies can be used to concretely push forward attempts to create different versions of capitalism. That's my hypothesis. You can all join me in proving that hypothesis. All right, so I actually want to provide just a little bit, like 3 minutes of history about capitalism. We can go back to Adam Smith. Let's see, what do we got? We have, what time is it? Okay, I can go back to Adam Smith, long time ago, right? The definition work he did around an economic system built around private ownership, the means of production, key phrase there. More relevant probably is thinking about the production of goods and services for profit, where we had an elevation of private property rights alongside the profit motive. And then also core to capitalism is the idea of market competition and how pricing is supposed to be a representation of resource availability and allocation interacting with supply and demand. I'm going to say that again because it's so not true. That pricing is supposed to be a representation of resource availability and allocation interacting with supply and demand. Has anybody here ever started a company? Have you worked on pricing strategy? Do you think that people pay what something is actually costs to produce? And do companies charge what something actually costs to produce? No. It's all emotional. It's not logical at all. That was the hardest thing as an academic turned entrepreneur to learn. Things are not fact-based. Anyway, importantly, capitalism today in the 21st century It has deviated from the principles articulated in the 18th century. Several of the changes associated with a marked decrease in the ability of the system to serve the needs of humans. The rise of monopoly capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is revisiting us today, thanks big tech, we've seen a massive concentration of capital into the hands of a small number of corporations and the individuals who are in control of them. And that's that graph that I showed earlier, right? That income inequality graph. We also have a bunch of neoliberal policies, which have brought deregulation and globalization and the myth of a free market, and changes to the way that capitalist societies create and then dismantle social safety nets and their policies. We've got Keynesian approaches that introduce regulation to stabilize economies in times of disruption. We got, anyway, lots and lots of change over the years. Waves after waves of change. And the takeaway there is that capitalism actually, it's not an unchanging ideology. What we think of today as capitalism has changed a lot. And there's no reason to consider it any kind of immutable force that is not subject to critique or subject to refashioning, I guess. We know that we can critique it, but the fact is we can change it. We don't just have to critique it, we can change it. Changes to social, political, and economic conditions have already dramatically altered what is considered capitalism today. And, you know, I want to push it a little bit further. So I'm going to talk about business models in a minute. I'll do a deep dive into business models, but I'm going to tell you this takeaway right now about business models. Because a lot of the proposals that I want to make sound kind of squishy and like, oh, why should we think about values when it comes to a business model? Business models should all be about profit. But the fact of the matter is, at least in the US, we have already decided that certain kinds of business models are not okay. So for example, we have something called antitrust legislation. And what that means is price fixing is bad and monopolies are bad. And if you do it, it's against the law. Which is very interesting because actually a monopoly is an excellent business model, right? If you could have a company that's a monopoly, that's a great business model. But at some point, as a country, culturally, we decided that wasn't okay. And so really what I'm saying is, we've already drawn the line, let's just nudge it a little bit further. Okay. And then I also, if this, yeah, Adrian, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. If it's an okay time to ask it.
Yeah, sure.
And so one thing I want to talk about is you mentioned Adam Smith, and what is your perspective on the invisible hand of the market? Because I do feel that there's a deep assumption in Adam Smith's philosophy around like human corruption and self-interest, and the idea that practicing business has been a civilizing force. And it's sort of like I think a through line. It's like, oh, we're all kind of bad, and so this supports our like inherent self-interest in a way that's like, you know, kind of tempered.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about that. A lot of thoughts and a lot of feelings. Can I save that for Q&A?
Sure.
Yeah, because I could. I know myself well enough to know that I could go off on a pretty dramatic tangent there. So, okay. But if this topic is generally of interest to you, I want to make a pitch from my favorite podcast. It's called Capital Isn't. And Luigi Zingales is a professor. He's an economist and professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Chicago. And so he works with Bethany, oh God, what's Bethany's last name? Bethany McLean, that's it. And they have this podcast, and they take on what they call the enablers who contribute to a warped version of capitalism. So distortions, the quote, distortions of the capitalist system by special interest groups. He's amazing. He runs the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago, and it's a great podcast. So that's my pitch. And then another piece of this puzzle. So again, you know, what Julie didn't say is my original PhD is actually in literature. So what that means is I did a lot of cultural theory, a lot of critical theory. And you learn to analyze power. Like almost all of my stuff is about how is power arranged in different configurations, different organizations. And when you look at entrepreneurship, how business is supposed to be conducted is one of the ways that power gets exercised. But another way is how venture capital works. And so I'm going to do a little digression on venture capital because otherwise I feel like it's such a powerful influence in how companies get built, that to ignore it leaves, it's just irresponsible because it leaves so much, it makes so much invisible. And honestly, one of the most important things in this kind of work is to make things visible, is to understand where power lies, how it gets exercised, and where you can find those intervention points. So venture capital has its own incentive structure. Are there any VCs in the room? And having the experience of helping build a venture capital firm from nothing to the closing a fund was very interesting. The incentive structures of venture capital, generally speaking, push companies to make decisions around growth that end up being extractive of society in fundamentally damaging ways. The irony is this often carries business risks over the long term, but those get ignored. And the conventional venture-funded businesses, they have a lot of constraints, most of which derive from the constraints of the power law. Do you guys know what the power law is? Power law, there's a book called Power Law, Thomas Malby. The short version is, if you are a venture capital investor who makes bets early on in a company's life, you have to assume that somewhere between 90 and 95% of the companies that you invest in are going to fail. Okay? So what that means is the ones that succeed have to succeed so massively that you can pay back your investors. So venture capitalists aren't the ones who put up the money. So they have what are known as LPs, limited partners. And the limited partners are wealthy individuals or institutions like endowments or pension funds, and they put the money into the fund. So let's say, it's basic math, you have a $100 million fund. Okay. And you want to have a big fund because you take a management fee of like 2%, and that's how you pay yourself if you're the person deciding, who to invest in. You got a $100 million fund. Okay, let's say 90%, because I want the math to be easy, 90% of my investments are going to fail. I put $1 million into every company, and I need to return at least 3x. For a fund to be okay, you have to return 3x. So let's say I need to return $300 million to my investors. Okay, so that means that 10% of the companies that I have successfully invested in have to get big enough that they're going to pay back cumulatively at least $300 million. And that's not even counting the dilution that happens because they're going to go on to raise more capital. So basically, companies have to get giant for venture capitalists to be able to pay back their investors. So you've heard the term hypergrowth. That's the reason VCs push hypergrowth. You often only get hypergrowth by doing things like, the attention economy and dark patterns, or turning your users into your product for advertising, or not offering, creating gig workers so you don't have to offer benefits so you can have better margins. All these things which are fundamentally not great for the overall society. So I feel like I can launch that critique because I am also a venture capitalist. So, okay, there's the power law for you. Okay, so how can we change the system? And essentially what happens if we narrow the gap between those who critique and those who make, whether you're making products, organizations, companies, products, etc. And because I think designers have a really great perspective on things, and I want them to feel like they can start companies, because I believe that if people who are embedded in design go on to start companies, they will build different kinds of companies. And one of the other reasons I've sort of formalized both teaching the class and I do a bunch of mentoring and all this other stuff I've been doing in entrepreneurship is because I started to notice more and more within academia, particularly a kind of us and them language, right? Those companies are doing bad things, but you know what? Those companies are run by people who are just like us, and we could be running those companies. There's no reason for that gap, and we can close that gap. I think we can close that gap, and we can build better. We can build a better world. We can. Kate Starbird would think this is hysterical that I'm so optimistic. So so I'm not the first person to think this way. There's a couple funds like Indie Fund and Tiny Seed are venture funds that are trying to do things a little bit differently. They recognize these perverse incentives for the way companies are built. There's also this really great group called Zebras Unite. It's a cooperative, and so they counter the mythology of a unicorn. I guess zebras aren't a mythology. They counter the mythos of whatever, unicorn versus zebra, right? Unicorn has to be giant, and zebras are in a dazzle together, and they're sort of promoting cooperatives as a different kind of structure, et cetera. There's also, people have done a ton of work around social impact companies. Familiar with the term? Yes, no?
Like B Corps?
No,
Okay.
different. Social impact companies are basically you build a company that is designed to make the world a better place by, I don't know, clean water or access to healthcare or things like that. So my inflammatory phrase about that is there's no such thing as a social impact company. And there are social impact investors, and they generally have less expectations in terms of their investment returns. But the reason I say there's no such thing as a social impact company is because every company has a social impact. And I think we should look at every company, and I think investors should evaluate every company with an eye to not just what is the financial return, but what is the impact that this company has on society. And so when we talk about social impact companies, we give everybody else a free pass, and I don't think they should have a free pass. But then there's also benefit corporations. Yep, B Corps, cooperatives, double bottom line, which is when you care about profit plus people. Triple bottom line is when you care about profit, people, and planet. So these are all, there's also employee-owned companies. Like there's a bunch of structures out there which are designed to foster different versions of entrepreneurship that are more beneficial to society. So B Corps are super interesting. They've been around a little over 10 years, maybe 15. And traditional corporation is a C Corp. And I'm talking a lot longer than I thought. I'm just, okay. B Corps are very interesting. You can Google them or ask Claude about them. But basically, it's a corporate structure where companies must provide a variety of benefits to society. So, and you get a scorecard, and people come and audit you. And these are all attempts to reform capitalism. But they're all somehow marginal or othered. And I would say let's change the norm. Let's challenge the norm. Go after the center of capitalist structures. So that said, let's talk about business models in the little bit of time we have left. All right. So when I first started pitching my company, people would say, "What's your business model?" And I would say, "Well, we're going to make a thing, and then we're going to sell it to people, and they're going to give us money for the thing. And that's our business model." And that didn't go over very well. Turns out that's not a business model. And one way to think about business models is they are essentially the infrastructure of innovation. Whether it's a widget or software or an LLM, that's essentially the water that flows through pipes. And we need to make sure that the right pipes are in place so to get that stuff of innovation to the customer at the other end. And oh my God, really? All right, I have a whole bunch of research here about business models, and I'm just gonna skip it all. But basically, business models are stories, and they are hypotheses. And if you look at all the literature around business models, they'll talk about this, but the hypotheses are all about how we make money, and the stories tend to be also about how we make money. And then there's this thing, the business model canvas, which I'm guessing a bunch of you have seen before, right? And then there's a bunch of versions of the business model canvas out there. There's for nonprofits and for thinking about environmental impact and yada, yada, yada. There's lots of versions of this. But one of the things that's so interesting about business models is that they also embed cultural values. But nowhere is that made explicit. It's just all embedded. And it's all, because it's implicit, we don't have an opportunity to talk about it, challenge it, and reframe it. So one of the things that we've been doing in my class over the last few years is figuring out what might a human-centered business canvas look like. So these are just some examples that students have done over the years. This one, where's my favorite? This is my favorite because it's such a mess. So it is, I think, actually an appropriate representation of how messy things can get. But basically, borrowing from that business model canvas approach, and instead of, one of the great things that the business model canvas does is it sort of boils down a lot of complexity, right? And puts it in these like, oh, we got 9 things you got to think about. But what we're trying to do is reduce that complexity to a snapshot, but maintain the visibility into the interrelationships among multiple elements and provide that opportunity to articulate the values, the cultural values, social, political values that are embedded in all of the decisions that get made as you build a company. And then this is one of my favorite examples of a company that has created a human-centered business model, not Mechanical Turk. No, this is, it's an alternative to Mechanical Turk. So Amazon Mechanical Turk is a way to do like, get users to do tasks, right? An alternative to that is a company called Prolific, which some of you might have encountered. Prolific is a platform for getting users to do research. But Prolific has built their whole platform around being fair to the people who are performing the tasks. So you can just look at the page. I mean, I don't know when I took this screenshot, it might look different now, but here's all about the pricing. It's all directed at you, who's paying. You decide how much to pay. You get to choose. You pay for only what you use. You can contrast that with Prolific and the payment principles, ethical rewards, right? So they set a floor. You can't go below that floor. It doesn't matter where the person is located. They are still a human being, and their labor should be rewarded equitably. So it's one really quick example of a business model and how you can do things differently. So there's a whole other thing in here about how customers, we could talk about customers. If you study entrepreneurship, you have heard the phrase, I'm sure, of the ICP, the ideal customer profile, and attaining product market fit, PMF. The problem is, when you figure out your PMF, you think, great, we're done, we know what our product market fit is, but it turns out that's actually just the beginning, because at that point you only know who's directly using your product, and you have not had an opportunity yet to think about the downstream impacts of your product. So you can think about outcomes-based design. Cheryl Kababa talks about this a lot. So we talk about sort of secondary and tertiary levels of customers who are impacted by your product being in the world, even if they're never your customer, in terms of paying you for the product. So that's some of the stuff. This is some more of the stuff. And then finally, I will just wrap up with what our goals are in the Human-Centered Entrepreneurship Lab, that twofold mission that I mentioned. The first is building better companies, doing things like creating that human-centered business model canvas to help surface the cultural values that are embedded within business models, thinking about outcomes-based design, reducing the imperative for extractive processes and thinking about funding models, thinking about new governance structures. So that's number one. And then the second part of it is how do we build different kinds of companies? So for that, that's going to start in 2025. And we're going to look at incubating those non-venture scale companies, so companies that are not going to be unicorns, but might still be doing something that is good for the world. How do we provide mentorship and rigor for those companies? So give them the rigor that comes with venture funding, but without the growth expectations, and then creating new funding mechanisms for them so you don't need that hyper growth return. So that's what I'm up to. Thank you very much. I had told Julie I was going to talk for only a short amount of time, but apparently